Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
Welcome to the Clean Air Act's Basics podcast. This is the first one that we've done. This is episode 1, and today we're going to talk about the history of the Clean Air Act. As a series, we're going to get into multiple episodes that address essential elements of the Federal Clean Air Act. But what we're talking about today is episodes that really helped frame what the law looks like. And we're also going to talk about some of the history of the law, what the law looked like prior to having a federal structure. My guest today is Dr. Devra Davis. Dr. Davis is the founding director of the Center for Environmental Oncology at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, and she was also a professor of epidemiology. She's served as a professor in a wide range of settings, and she's currently the founder of the Environmental Health Trust in Wyoming. That's a group that provides research and education about environmental health hazards. Most notably, I asked Dr. Davis to join me today because she wrote a book that was published back in 2002. The book is called When Smoke Ran Like Water, and it talks about environmental stories and environmental issues that really, without some of the science, without some of the epidemiology, we have trouble seeing. And this is a book. I've been an environmental litigator for the United States Department of Justice for 17 years. I'm a Clean Air Act attorney, and I've spent a little over the past 10 years teaching at the University of Maryland School of Law. And this is a book that I teach from. And I'm going to open up with a pair of questions for Dr. Davis. The first, I understand it's really hard to determine the impact of a pollution event on the human population. And my two questions are, why is that so hard to do, and how can epidemiology help?
The reason it's so hard to determine the impact of pollution is that there are multiple causes of the same disease. So one can have heart disease because of what you eat. You can have heart disease because of what water you drink, and you can have heart disease because of what air you breathe. And all of them are relevant. So ferreting out the relative contribution of the environmental pollution to the total burden of heart disease is really challenging. And that's where the tools of epidemiology come in handy, because epidemiology has several different methods that it can use to look at patterns in populations over time that allow us to elucidate what are the causal factors. Nowadays, we understand that air pollution does kill people, not usually directly, although it did in the case of my hometown of Donora, but indirectly over long periods of time. And we know that children who grow up in a polluted environment with air pollution tend to have much more asthma, tend to have smaller lung capacity, and as they age, will tend to have more lung disease as well, all because as they were growing up, they were living in an environment with just a little bit more air pollution. Those are the tools that epidemiology can use to evaluate what's going on. Now, epidemiology comes from two Greek words, meaning epi, upon, and demos, the people. Epidemiology evaluates the past. It cannot tell us about the future. So in order for epidemiology to exist when it comes to chronic patterns of air or water pollution, you have to be able to look backwards and know what the patterns of pollution were and look to the present to see what the patterns of disease are and make an association between the two. Toxicology, which I'm also trained in, on the other hand, looks at animals and cell cultures and says, can we predict what's going to happen to people? And there's been in the law an evolution, I think, since Dalbert and others, to insist on epidemiological evidence as proof of harm before legitimating steps to prevent future harm. And I actually am of the opinion that that is, to use a legal term, back-asswards. That is the wrong approach to say, where's the proof? Where are the bodies? Rather, we should take a better approach of looking at the models and looking at the animal data, because the animals predict human effects. We study animals, for example, to make drugs. We don't introduce a drug in humans first, even with the vaccines, which were rushed. We started out with animal trials. So we use animals to predict the effects for drugs, but when it comes to environmental matters, we tend to have a whole cottage industry in raising doubts about animal studies and saying, show me the proof, show me the bodies. And I think that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way case law has recently evolved. That perhaps is a longer discussion.
So this is interesting because it brings in something that I was going to try to cover early in the podcast, which is, I think that, the law and the science sometimes talk different languages, and they're both coming from different places, and they intersect sometimes in a case or sometimes in a rule. And what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, because I've seen it happen where we're dealing with a legal paradigm that came from, kind of its own unique history and was really developed to try to do something different. That's definitely true in the history of air regulation. Basically before the Federal Clean Air Act existed, and California in particular had its own state provision. But before that, you could really only deal with an air contamination problem by using traditional tools of tort law. Primarily nuisance law and trespass. What nuisance is, you have to prove that there's an unreasonable act by a defendant, that those acts have continued, that there's a causal connection between the two, and that there's damage. It has to be substantial damage. You have to be able to show that a reasonable individual would have thought that the nuisance was substantial. So it's a really hard thing to prove. Trespass too, unlawful intrusion. So you have to show there was an intent to intrude or a negligent intrusion, something that a reasonable person wouldn't have done, and that caused harm. And in those kinds of settings, if you're dealing with something like air pollution, it's traditionally really hard to meet just the burden of proof. And that's even without kind of some of the things that have developed over time to try to kind of limit these effects. And so I was going to ask you, in your experience, where do you see the most tension between the development of the evidentiary burdens of law and of science?
That's the right question. I think when it comes to causation, what is causation in law and what is causation in science are totally different. And I don't think it's widely appreciated. In most of public health science, causation exists when there is a 5% chance that it could be false. In other words, if you have a 95% chance that your findings are correct, then that is considered a causal relationship. And that actually, I believe, is an over-reliance on a statistical determination. And there are methods that have been developed for how do you get to the 95% confidence limit, and there's books written about it. But one of, I think, the most astute writers in this whole field is Kenneth Rothman of Harvard. And he noted that we have become blinded by the requirements in public health research of reaching the 95% confidence interval. And sometimes you have findings in public health science that are 70% or 80%, but you really should pay attention to it. In law, of course, you have totally different sense for causation. You can have, is it more probable than not? Literally 50.5% versus 49.5%. You can have beyond a reasonable doubt, as you must have in criminal prosecution. And there's quite a long range of causation in law than there is in science. And in science, we really are often hamstrung by an overly strict interpretation of what it means to establish causation. And in fact, in public health research, there have been principles that have been enunciated by Bradford Hill that are often misconstrued as being guidance that you have to meet all these criteria to establish causation. And they include, are your findings consistent among studies? Are your findings reliable? Is there biological plausibility? Is there statistical significance? That comes at the very end. And is there coherence to the findings? And when you look at all of those criteria, and they are not criteria in the sense that you tick them off, they're considerations for inferring causation, because causation is inferred in public health research as it is in law. But the evidentiary burden for causation in law is fundamentally different than it is in science. And that creates, I think, what you've just identified correctly, an enormous tension between the two. What is the requirement of causation in environmental law generally?
Well, so it's interesting because causation generally is something that's developed in the context of fact-specific cases, and those cases come up where the lens of whether causation has happened in law really evolved through tort law, where the fact finder is trying to put themselves in the frame of a reasonable person, and that reasonable person is a person in a setting in the world, and this world has industry and wants to have a healthy economy and also wants people to live, and so there's this weird tension in the law and the development of the law, where you could see that the voice of wanting to have a healthy economy and wanting to support industry, it guides the development of these legal standards, which have so much tension with the scientific standards. Is if you have industry that has access to more facts than kind of a random individual saying there's soot on the walls of my house and I want you to clean it, and the industry controls those emissions, they control the scientists, they pay them, they're on their payroll, they know what they emit, they know the inputs. The random person down the street who sees a problem or maybe thinks that their kid's asthma is caused by these emissions, they have problems of proof, and then the person making that judgment and effectively determining what the legal standard is often a court, trying to balance when there's a disparity of information going into it, and you're trying to set a rule as a court that you can live with as a society. Is like, what does tort law mean in a brand new setting? Well, the court decides it in the setting of those cases. And I guess one thing that I would ask about you, and this might be the time to turn to air inversions, is from what I understand, there was, especially as our country became more industrialized, but this is also probably true in Europe, there were more and more kind of pronounced air problems over major population centers. And I was wondering if you could tell me, like, how does an air inversion work, and how can you figure out the impacts of that from your public health perspective?
Well, normally, as you know, hot air rises. That's how hot air balloons work. And when I interviewed people about what happened in Donora, they said it was very strange, because Donora was a small working class town around the horseshoe bend of the Monongahela River. And around that horseshoe bend, there was this gigantic factory, more than 5 stories tall. And you could not see the river from the street because it was so high. And that factory worked 24 hours a day. And that factory used as much coal in the small town of Donora as the entire city of Pittsburgh. So it was one of the world's largest nail mills. It had one of the world's largest zinc plants, coke ovens, rolling mills, and all of them were working 24/7. And so the hot air and smoke from the factory would rise up. And yes, the people closest by would get the deposition of the soot. But I remember we used to clean the walls in my family home, and I was tall. So that was something we would do twice a year. The walls would have soot on them, and you would just clean them off because that was just the way it was. Well, hot air rises, and when you have an inversion, what you have is a stationary mass of cooler air that sits on the area and doesn't move. And when that happens, the hot air, the smoke goes up. And in one description, the smoke from a locomotive, which was coal-fired back then, goes up, travels right across the horizon, and came right back down. It was quite a striking phenomenon. So there was something unusual. This mass of stationary air trapped the hot fumes, and they couldn't dissipate. They couldn't go up. And 5 days, this sat there. And after the 5th day, people knew there was something unusual. People described trying to walk, and they could not see their feet. The smoke was so thick. I interviewed a young woman who happened to work with my grandfather, who walked across the Webster-Donora Bridge, which has since been blown up. That's how old this all is. And she recalled having to hold on to the bridge because she couldn't see her feet to walk. And in this situation, the smoke was so dense that the inversion just smacked those fumes down. Now, the interesting thing is that normally you think of inversions and you can see them if you're in Salt Lake City or Denver, because you've got cities that are at high altitude surrounded by mountains that are higher. And obviously the cold air from the mountains rolls down into the valley and can trap fumes from cars today from Salt Lake or Denver in this lower basin of Denver or Salt Lake. But Donora wasn't surrounded by mountains. It was the hills of Donora, some of the oldest in the United States, are just 400 to 600 feet taller than the river valley, 400 to 600 feet. And it's interesting that just that difference was enough to keep the trapped fumes right there in this small valley area. And it stayed there. And at the end of 5 days, people started to drop dead. And at the end of that period of time, there were 20 deaths in this small working class town of about 14,000 at the time. The funeral homes ran out of caskets. The florists ran out of flowers. And the drugstores ran out of drugs to treat people because something was different. And people knew something was different at the time.
The something was different is really why this Donora event. So this happened, I believe, in 1948, and it resulted in just a dramatic number of deaths given the number of people in the town. And that's the reason that this event gets, is such a kind of a dramatic part of this story. Is typically when you have an inversion, as I understand it, over a big city, statistically, I think we can show that a greater number of people die during these events, but it's hard to attach that death to the event. But here we have a case where there were very few people, there were comparatively a lot of deaths, and you could see the pollution, like the cause was actually there. So all those causation problems that you run into in the legal setting we were talking about before, you kind of got past those real fast because you could see the pollution. And so I guess what I was wondering is could you tell me, why do we have so much trouble connecting, or can we, can we use epidemiology, or can we use the science to connect death or harm to pollution events in other settings? And how directly can we make that connection?
Those are excellent questions. And you're absolutely right. Because Donora was such a small town, and because normally nobody died, when you had 20 deaths in 5 days, it was a catastrophe. And it actually made Walter Winchell news reports, mysterious death fog in Donora. It made national and international news because because it was a small town. These were small numbers, and normally nobody died. The difficulty, and it's a real difficulty, is how do you evaluate something like that in New York or Los Angeles, where the same thing took place at about that time, but not in the same intensity? That is to say, when you go back and look at the records in Birmingham, Alabama, which was the Pittsburgh of the South, so to speak, you can see patterns there in large populations that were undeniable in this small town. And that is the challenge of public health research. We were the original big data people before the name big data existed. We have to look at patterns in populations over time, and patterns of death, patterns of health, and patterns of pollution. And we are able to connect them now in ways that we could not before, largely because of tools that have been devised and statistical modeling packages that now exist that we did not have back then. And some of the early researchers like Lester Lathe and Gene Seskin, who developed some very rudimentary analyses of these patterns, were economists. And they, by the way, were under a huge attack when they produced analyses for the entire United States, where they looked at all of the counties and they took data on pollution and data on death rates, very crude analysis, and they showed there's a relationship between the two. And they were subjected to all kinds of criticism because this, you can't say this, you can't be sure, you can't know. Reality is now, thanks to work done by Joel Schwartz and many colleagues, Doug Dockery and others at Harvard, we now know that very sophisticated modeling has confirmed what these early pioneering researchers first warned about, which is that consistent patterns of elevated air pollution over long periods of time actually have a demonstrated quantitatively significant effect on death, as well as on patterns of lung disease, bronchitis, and asthma in children. That cannot be denied now, but it was not understood then. And the Denora killer smog of 1948 really put a clear benchmark. This is what can happen with a lot of pollution in a small period of time. Now let's start to ask about what happens for longer periods of pollution over longer periods of time.
And when it comes to the development of the law itself, Denora was an important point because it was just such a tangible and salient story. Another part of the story from the legal perspective is really what the developments in Los Angeles in California. They were having their own inversion problems. It was also visible because of the nature of the climate here, and that's a city that's surrounded by mountains. And their smog issues became more and more intense through the 1940s. And one thing that's interesting is because they had their version of a tangible problem, you could see it. It was burning your eyes when people were going outside. Los Angeles actually was, or California was the first state in the country to really focus on air pollution as a problem, a statewide problem. They put together a Bureau of Smoke Control in 1947. They passed their version of the Air Pollution Control Act, which actually created air pollution districts for every county of the state. And so that was the first real attempt in law to kind of systemically address this problem. But I don't know, have you ever looked at smog formation or the impacts of smog in Los Angeles or California at all?
Oh, of course. And in fact, very painfully so, because my favorite uncle, everybody has one, my favorite uncle dropped dead in 1969 in the midst of what was, in fact, a major air pollution inversion in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, like Denora, the mountains around it aren't very high, but they're high enough that stationary masses of air could be trapped there. And my uncle was quite an avid athlete, and he would run several miles a day, would swim, and dropped dead on a squash court surrounded by doctors with whom he was playing. But every one of the 20,000 breaths he took every day had in it ultrafine particulate air pollution, elevated levels of carbon monoxide, and other materials that would be circulated throughout his body. Because when you breathe in ultrafine particles, the smaller the particles, the more deeply they can get distributed throughout the body. They go into the heart and lungs through inspiration, and then they move through into the bloodstream and can be distributed throughout the body and essentially create what's called serum viscosity. So people who are in episodes of severe air pollution literally will have thicker blood. This increases their risk of stroke, of a heart attack, which is probably what killed my young uncle. And he had no idea that all the exercise he was doing under a period of intense air pollution was hastening his death. No idea whatsoever. We do have data. So that time that my uncle died was a time when many others died during that particular episode of air pollution in 1969 in Los Angeles. And the California governor at the time had 5 children, and it is reported that 2 of them had asthma. And he became very concerned about their health. And there were women who would demonstrate with their babies in strollers, wearing gas masks, saying, "We want clean air." And that became a very important part of what led to the formation of the first air pollution regulations in the world, which came out of California.
So what one question is, when you're determining the cause of death, when you're determining why someone died, and it is a matter of physiology, you can look and you can see they have markers that indicate their body was under stress, and there's multiple, as you mentioned early in the conversation, there's multiple potential causes of that stress. It could be air, it could be water, it could be exposures in the workplace, it could be any of a number of things. But when it comes to actually attaching a cause of death, the kind of thing that you as an epidemiologist can look at, the records that you use to kind of find your patterns, what would that death certificate say? In other words, how far down the causal chain do we get when we assign a cause of death?
Yeah, as I've noted, air pollution never appears on most people's death certificates, and it should. In the case of my uncle, I don't doubt what they said is heart disease runs in the family. Yeah, it sure did. But it ran in the family. We can't say to what extent that became a consequence of the fact that the family grew up in this polluted environment. My mother, her mother, my grandmother, who I adored, had 25 heart attacks. Her heart attacks were so common to me as a young girl that I always assumed she would come back. My mother would rush over and drag me with her, and I would watch when the doctor would come, and all they would do would put a tent over her and an oxygen tank then to try to give her more oxygen to breathe, because that's all they could do back then in the 1940s and 50s. And so nobody said her death was from air pollution, because of course that wasn't understood then. Now there is a bit more sophistication, and in Japan at least, air pollution did appear on death certificates, and Japan has a compensation system for victims of air pollution. I believe it's one of the only in the world. That's something that perhaps you can pursue in a subsequent podcast. I know Julian Gresser was involved as an attorney at Harvard Law, working with the Japanese to develop this compensation system. And it was quite unique because they had undeniable episodes of severe air pollution in certain areas and with people with massive amounts of lung disease. So in Japan, it may be, but in the United States, air pollution does not appear on anybody's death certificate. And by the way, people had the idea that because air conditioning had just come out in cars, that they were being protected. And you can still be in a car, and if you don't shut off the outdoor air soon enough, your car air quality can be 10 times worse than that of the surrounding environment, especially if you're in traffic.
So it sounds like, even for an event like Denora, which it did connect to air pollution, it's hard for that to be tangible and measurable given the data that we had available at that point in time. And for something like Los Angeles, or I know there were chronic inversions in New York and in London, all we really know is statistics. We don't have an acute cause and effect back and forth. And that's part of the reason why it's hard to move policy until you get, like you mentioned, a governor with a kid who has asthma. Like that I feel like actually makes things happen in a way that you can't, based on, 10,000 death certificates that say heart condition. It's really interesting to hear about Japan. I hadn't heard about that. So it does sound like there's a move in place to connect the cause and the effect in the air pollution setting. But do you know of any history of trying to do that, before the 1970s, before we had federal statutes?
I know of no history trying to do that. I know it was I've interviewed the people who were in charge of developing standards for the governor of California, and they were absolutely flabbergasted when they were asked to do this. And they said, what's a standard? I mean, literally. And this was Lester Breslow, who was an amazing beacon in public health, and his wife, Devra Breslow, one of the few people with whom I share a first name. And they talked about how the governor Goodwin Knight, known as the name Goody Knight, sent his trusted expert to tell them, you guys, we need standards. And I'm going to give you, I think it was 3 months to develop them. And so they began to look at what they knew. And he wanted to know, when does smog become a killer? Because at that point, it was clear to anyone living in the Los Angeles basin that even though the hills were not more than 1,000 feet higher, they were really worried about was the damage to the car, the paint. People were really worried about the damage to their cars because, this was the car culture. California existed with the cars because of the great streetcar conspiracy, which Roger Rabbit cartoon has portrayed probably pretty accurately. They ripped up the streetcar tracks, and that ripping up the streetcar tracks was done in order to make people have to buy more cars. So then you had a situation where this car culture, people were so concerned about the paint on their cars, but they weren't concerned about their lungs. It was pretty interesting.
That raises an interesting legal point. One of the things that's interesting about tort law and using that as a tool to combat air pollution is if you have a damage that's something like the paint on my car is bubbling, it's so much easier to get that as a remedy because there's a market for it. You can take it to a paint shop. They'll charge you X amount of thousands of dollars. They'll strip the paint and they'll redo it. And so that's the kind of harm that our law was really developed to address. And then you have these air issues where the harm is displaced over distance because air spreads, and the harm is displaced over time because it takes constant exposure, sometimes over years, to have an impact. And the remedies that we had set up in this tort law aren't really well equipped. You typically can't get an injunction. You typically can't stop the emission. It's really geared to buy you a new car, to paint over your wall. It's not geared to fix your lung problems. And so we really had a legal problem in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s that we were trying to solve, California first, and then evolving into, the first federal Clean Air Act in 1963. And then we had more events like the ones in Los Angeles and New York.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to see. I know there were also significant inversion events in Europe. They have a longer industrial history than we do. These aren't just the United States. And were there salient events outside of the United States that really raised the profile of this as an issue?
Well, the history of this goes back to the Meuse Valley in Belgium, near a town near Liège, and I visited there, and it was déjà vu. Because as we drove up to the top of the valley, it looked exactly like Denora, a long river valley around a curve, hills about 400 to 600 feet above it, the remnants of a steel factory that we could see. And in Liège, in 1938, in the Meuse Valley, they had an episode of extra deaths. That's what they called it. But remember, there was a time before the internet. And people actually did not have ready access to information. We did not have, instant television with being bombarded 24/7 with nonsense as we have had now. And so this event in the Meuse Valley was not widely appreciated. Then, of course, you had you had many episodes in California of smog. People knew things were bad because their eyes burned and the rubber hoses cracked. And again, they probably could have gotten compensation for cracked hoses more so than for their burning eyes at the time, because the causal relationship had not been established. And establishing causation, it gets down to the different evidentiary burdens in public health as compared to the law when it comes to establishing causation. And so you had this situation where the governor of California at first pleaded with the big oil companies to shut down the El Segundo refinery area, which was right outside of Los Angeles, and contributed to it. But people weren't thinking, not just the oil refineries, but the cars were themselves part of the problem, a big part of the problem. And in my book, I talk about the kind of almost comical discovery and recognition of the problem there in Los Angeles. The other episode that I think really drove global understanding of this issue occurred in London over the winter of 1952 to 53, when the same conditions that hit Donora hit London. London then was the world's largest city. And it is also in a valley, not a very high one, but surrounded by hills, the Thames River being the lowest point. And so there were pictures from that time where you would see the smoke shrouding the entire city, but you could see the Tower of London above it only, peeking out above it. And again, I tell in my book the story of how a blind man, tap, 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 led people back to their home because nobody could see. They were blind. And in that reality, he was the king. The blind man was the king because he could lead people back to their homes because nobody could see what was going on. And in London, at first, the government was struggling, of course, because this was just after the World War II ended. People were still eating horse meat for food. The country was broke. They were selling all of their clean coal for exports, and they were burning really dirty peat and dirty brown coal. We know that the darker black coal, the anthracite, burns more cleanly, and the brown coal and the peat moss, literally almost like a variation of the ground, can be used to burn, but the pollution from it is just horrific. And so London was broke. The government under Harold Macmillan was very reluctant to take any steps. And then Winston Churchill was the prime minister, and he just blustered because London was famous for its fog for years. In fact, they have a clothing design line named after the London fog, right? And people boasted about it. And it was a source of artistic inspiration. Monet painted more than 100 canvases of the London smog, some of which have sold recently for more than $100 million. And Monet talked about how inspiring the smogs were, because you could, if you squinted, you got more interesting colors than the bright, boring sunlight. He literally talked about that. So the fog of London was an inspiration to artists, and it was regarded with some as almost like a badge of honor. So the British had stiff upper lips, but they didn't have stiff lungs. And as a consequence, when people started to die in London, at first the government eagerly latched on to the idea that there'd been a massive flu epidemic. There wasn't. And I was able to show with Professor Michelle Bell, now at Yale University, we produced a series of papers that demonstrated there was no flu. There was obviously some flu, but it was not nearly a massive epidemic. In fact, instead, there was an increased level of deaths that went on not just for the 10 days of this recorded smog, but for 3 months. And the true toll of the London killer smog was not the 3,000 that the government admitted to immediately and tried to write off as a massive flu. The true toll of the London killer smog of 1952-53 was 12,000 additional deaths beyond what should have happened. And that's a problem that we have in epidemiology, because you see, 12,000, it's a big number, just like the more than 500,000 that have died of the pandemic now. But each one of those deaths is an empty seat at a table somewhere. And it's hard for epidemiology to paint what that really means. That's part of the reason that I wrote my book, When Smoke Ran Like Water, because I lived it. I experienced it. I lost members of my family, some of them at very young ages. And I only realized as I became an epidemiologist myself that the patterns of death and illness in my own family reflected the pollution of the environment in which we all grew up.
It's also tied to, as you were saying, part of the reason in the London example that we had those emissions is they were having economic problems and they were burning kind of dirtier burning fuels because that was more cheaply available. And this is something I think we see again and again is emissions are tied to, sometimes economic concerns, sometimes economic development. And the early tools we had to remedy that were really one-offs. I have a problem with with smoke in a particular instance, and I have a challenge and I have to connect it to a particular emission source. And we didn't have the tools to kind of deal with this as a problem systemically. And it was clearly becoming more and more apparent because of London, because of Los Angeles, because of New York, because of acute events like Denora, that we have a big systemic problem. We don't have tools to deal with it systemically at all. And that's really what we started to see starting in the mid 1960s, when the first federal Air Quality Act was started in 1967, and that really was the first time we saw interstate pollution standards. And then the first modern Clean Air Act was the Muskie Act that was passed in 1970, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the series going forward, is how that works. And it's super complicated. It's got a lot of tools, but the reason that we need all those tools is because we need to be able to remedy this problem that integrally tied to how people see themselves in London, because they like the fog, and it's tied to their art. How people in Los Angeles see themselves as a car culture, and everything they do is tied to their cars, and how the economy works. And it's all integrated, and you need a tool that can balance these things, which leads to a very sophisticated tool. And it rose out of this very complicated background that I think is fascinating. But I know that you have time limits, so I want to see, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, I'd like to give you a little pop quiz. Guess who said this in 1970 on New Year's Day? America pays its debt to the past by reclaiming the purity of its air, its waters, and our living environment. It is literally now or never.
I am going to say, was it Nixon?
You're right. It was Richard Nixon on New Year's Day. And as you know, and I'm sure you're going to discuss this, Nixon was trying to become Mr. Green because he knew that Muskie was on his coattails. And the rivalry between Nixon and Muskie, and to some extent Kennedy, to try to see who could be more environmental, was really declared. And on New Year's Day, 1970, Richard Nixon gave that speech. He gave that speech from a White House where he liked to put logs in the fireplace in the summer because he liked the cozy feeling of it. He was not much of an environmentalist, we know that, but he was a brilliant politician and one of our best environmental presidents, because he saw correctly that the public was demanding clean air. And remember, that was before the first Earth Day that Gaylord Nelson started with Dennis Hayes, who's now an elder citizen of the whole movement. The first Earth Day was that same year. And there was a massive global support for cleaning up the air and the water. As you know very well, the Cuyahoga River caught fire. That's how bad the pollution was. Denora at that point and London were part of our history. And you had evidence of Love Canal and a lot of lesser known places like Triana, Alabama, and what we call Cancer Alley, which still is an abomination on our nation that exists in the South today from petrochemical refineries. So the awareness of environmental damage was so acute that Richard Nixon became the leader of seeing that we had environmental policies developed. And by the end of 1970, literally on New Year's Eve, Bill Ruckelshaus was called to the White House, and I talked to him about this, as the president signed the Clean Air Act. And that marked that the year of 1970 was an amazing year. There was so much going on in the country. And the president played what he called his trump card, no pun intended. And he created the EPA out of a budget of $1.4 billion. And the beginnings of EPA, it's hard to imagine how incredibly enthusiastic each one of those employees were. They came from, I think, 15 different federal agencies. They were brought together in an amalgamation. And there was a vibrancy and a commitment to a mission that is very hard for people to understand nowadays. And I think, if I may, in wrapping up this conversation, say that what EPA had at the beginning was trust. The American people trusted that their government was going to do the right thing. They had faith in their government. We've lost those things now. We need to get them back. And I hope that your podcast is going to be part of educating people about the origins of what gave rise to what was really one of the most remarkably effective institutions in the beginning in the history of environmental policy. The Environmental Protection Agency had a mandate, it had a leader in the form of Bill Ruckelshaus, and it had recruited people who were deeply committed to seeing that Denora and London would not happen again.
I want to thank you for joining me today, Dr. Davis. It was honestly, it was an honor talking to you. I want you to know that your work has really changed a lot of what I've done in my life, and I appreciate you sharing those stories with people. And it was an honor.
The honor is mine. Thank you so much, Matt. Look forward to chatting again if we can.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/environ. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.